welcome to Inside Events, an international podcast examining contemporary issues and ideas in events. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Chris Gaffney at New York University, who'll be talking about the realpolitik of mega events. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming in. So the first question really is who are you? What's your role, the organization that you work for, and why are you interested in the realpolitik of mega events?
Chris Gaffney. I'm a geographer by training, and my original research was into the history and culture of football stadiums in Latin America, particularly in Brazil and Argentina. And I guess this is a way of getting to the interest of why I'm interested in is because there are so many intricate social, political, economic interests within the football cultures of Latin America that I started seeing games for being more than the games. Of course, when we're just a fan, we go and see the game on the field and we get excited and emotional about this. But all of the political intrigue between club owners, the economic basis of their support, how sport manifests well beyond the game, and how it is really an essential tool for understanding the politics of a city like Buenos Aires or the politics of a city like Rio de Janeiro. You can enter into it through their football stadiums, through their teams, etc. And so when I started going beyond just kind of the ramifications of stadiums and cities and looking at what happens in the trajectory of a city when the World Cup comes to town, or when a city's 200-year history crashes into the Olympics, and all those global political, economic interests, you have this really amazing intersection of competing dynamics, historical narratives, and a really rich political field through which to wade around to get your fingers dirty.
And kind of, I guess, personally, like, is there a particular kind of personal motive for studying this beyond what you just mentioned?
Oh yeah. Well, in my personal motivation is I was a football fan, and I played football as long as I could and loved the game, thought I understood the game, and then was just so horrified by seeing what people were doing with the game and using the game to exploit people, to extract resources from one part of the town and give it to another. The violence that was embedded in Argentine football was just kind of overwhelming. And to see the things, so nominally we're there to watch the sport and to have communities. That's what we try to, at least in where I grew up in the U.S., there wasn't much to think about. You go to the game and, sure, there's public subsidies, etc. But then the other stuff behind it was terrible. And really this started when one of the reasons I first left the United States was that I grew up in Arlington, Texas, which is home of the Rangers. George W. Bush funded his initial gubernatorial run when he became governor of Texas by buying the Rangers team, got some money from Saudi Arabia, invested, and then convinced the city of Arlington to put in like $150 million for a new stadium for the Rangers, which quadrupled the value of the franchise, which he then sold and used the money to run for governor. And so that was happening at my local stadium. And so then I was like, well, it can't just be here. This is, and so it's been a bit of a crusade ever since.
And the concept of realpolitik, like we said before we kind of started recording, like it's a concept that most people probably haven't heard of, or they'll know the implications of, but they won't have necessarily heard of as a concept. How would you kind of break down that concept just to make it easy as possible for someone to understand what you mean by the realpolitik?
Right. So realpolitik comes out of discussions in the mid-19th century around, with all the Germans and French and Italians and Prussians and Austro-Hungarians, and how do you manage these very complex political relations without having to stand on a moral or ethical line. And so the consideration of doing business with Russian gas interest has nothing to do with German professions to be wanting to further democracy in the world. They need gas, so they're getting gas from the Russians. There's a practical consideration, the practical outcome of a policy decision that has nothing to do with moral or ethical considerations. And so in in the context of the events, it means that the realpolitik means that when we take our rose-tinted glasses of sports off and we say, okay, the sports are one thing, we're all coming together, etc. It's a feel-good moment, but it doesn't feel good for everybody. It doesn't feel good, in the same way for everybody. And some people are actually quite traumatized by this. So what are the conditions? So if we remove those filtering conditions of the moral and ethical, and we look at the practical outcomes of what these events are achieving, then it becomes really clear that this is a lot of business as usual, that we're being sold as something that's good for the world in terms of uplift or development or whatever.
And so kind of you mentioned that it's from the mid 1900s. Like, has this kind of concept changed at all, as like kind of academic in its kind of conceptual sense, as well as practical application sense? How has it evolved maybe over that kind of 70 years, or however many decades that you choose to
Yeah,
use
well, I
as your
think
range?
we saw this very much. I mean, it comes in and out of consciousness, and I think at certain points in history we think of it differently. And so, the 1936 Olympics are, of course, well remembered for being the Nazi Games, as it were. And the Nazis didn't care about promoting sport or Olympic ideals or whatever. They're using the games for a very practical end, and that's the realpolitik of the Nazi Games, is the assertion of state power. And so the practical outcome of a policy decision that is totally devoid of the associative moral or ethical consideration of hosting the games, peace on earth, etc. Which, of course, was not true from the beginning anyway, but we shroud it in this. And then it kind of gets stripped away again. We start forgetting about sports as politics by another means, and just kind of associate sport with the political outcome. The US beats Russia, or Russia beats the US, or there's a boycott, or whatever. And so we tend to get upset when those realpolitik elements invade the life of sport, when in reality they're behind the scenes all the time. And so when people say, well, we want to keep politics out of sport, what they're meaning to say is, don't talk to me about politics while I'm enjoying the game. We don't want to know about that stuff. We hear about that in every other facet of life. But for me, one of the reasons that people should care about this is that because we do care so deeply about sport, we should also understand the implications. And we need to understand the political implications of our leisure choices, as much as we try to understand the political implications of our consumer choices, where we buy organic or non-organic, if we choose to go on a cruise ship or not, do we travel in one way or another? All the other things that we make ethical and moral considerations around, we tend to ignore in sport. And so by understanding the mechanisms, the political, the cold cut decision, I'm going to do this, going to get the games for this outcome, and I don't care about the feel-good FIFAism. These are the actual practical things that we're going to get out of this, and when we understand those better, then we can use sport to either mitigate those harms or to try to use sport for the thing that we know it to be really great at, which is bringing people together and creating sense of shared narratives and common cultural history across multiple generations and all across the world.
And Chris, do you think that consumers, and I can't say consumers of these events, because actually I find that, sorry, there's a lawnmower going off somewhere. Do you find that the consumers of these events, not just kind of the visitors that go to them and consume them physically on the ground, but also kind of what's appeared to be like local authorities that are really like profess to be hand-tied by these things? Oh, we can't do that because of X, Y, Z protocol, etc. Do you find that they're increasingly critical of their consumption of these things, or is that changing? Are we getting better at being more critical about the consumption and production of them, or is things not changing much?
I don't honestly see it changing. I just see it shifting. And so if we consider the reality is that these events produce they increase flows of all kinds. They increase money flows, they increase information flows, human flows. And the more things flow, the more things grow, generally in the global economy. And so these events are not anti-growth, low carbon, no plastic, we're going to restructure the transportation system to have more walkable cities. They're not about that. It's about more airline flights, more cars, more Coca-Cola, more uniforms. And so we have to go from the premise that people are pursuing these events out of a growth mentality, and kind of and using the events as with a view to what the world is going to be like. And so I consider mega events in particular to be the spear tip of capitalism, because I'm not sure what's going to happen in 2028, not even in my own life, the planet, whatever, but I do know that the Olympics are going to be in Los Angeles. It's kind of the only thing I can say about 2028 is that there's going to be Olympics in Los Angeles, and we've known that for a very long time. And so we've kind of thrown this spear of capitalism into the future, and it's landed in Inwood in LA. And that spear tip is having all kinds of radical, transformative effects in the places where it hits. And some of those are by design, and some of those are not. And so I think that people pursue these events with understanding that those transformations are going to happen when you bring the events and you intersect it with your city, and that the vested interests are very much behind maximizing the benefit for them from the places which that spear has hit. And so I don't think it's getting better, because it can't get better by design, because capitalism doesn't get better by design. No one consumes less voluntarily, or few people do. It's not in the DNA of capitalism to say, let's grow less, let's have a smaller event. And so I think that we're just now selling different things. And so we're selling facial recognition technology for entry into stadiums. We're selling drone technology, bio registries for VIPs, tips, robot dogs. All these things are now what's for sale in these events, and those in turn are driving the consumption of all those products that are the sponsors of the event. And so I just don't think by design, it's never going to get better.
Kind of some of the, I've written quite a bit of critical stuff as well as kind of appreciative stuff of them as platforms for exposing social critique. And we've seen, in Japan, an exposure of kind of like child pornography and child sex issues, and there's been some kind of policies that have been designed in order to kind of protect child interests and all. So that there are some marginal gains with hosting these things, but the net outcome is that what you would argue? The net outcome is always worse as a result of hosting these games in terms of that being net positive or negative on society.
Without question, every instance is net negative. And the reality is that if we wanted to tackle child pornography, we don't need an Olympic Games to do it. It certainly gives it a platform, but if we want to spend $20 billion on tackling child pornography, why do we build a stadium to deal with child pornography? That's ridiculous. But there is this kind of symbolic weight to it, and you can use it as a platform for these things. But on the whole, environmentally, socially, politically, even culturally, it's degrading, and it's homogenizing, and it's exploitative, and it's sexualized and non-transparent, and it feeds into a global ecosystem of elite privilege that I think is fundamentally noxious to life on the planet. And so when you look at the realpolitik behind it, you also have to look at the actors and their political connections. And so if you look at the list of the people on the IOC, you can see they're linked to multinational construction firms. It's the Sheikh of Qatar, it's the Baron of something in France, it's the former Minister of Culture of Thailand, it's the right-hand man of the President of Colombia. It's the global 1% or whatever. All these people with the vested interest are the ones charged with making policy around it at that highest level. And then at the local level, if you think of Boris Johnson and his strategic use of the 2012 Olympics as a political platform to get the foreign minister and then prime minister, which of course had lovely effects for the UK as a whole. And so that's also, that on the very personal political level, these are staging points along a political career. And so there are so many levels you can understand the politics of it. And I think that we should very much care about how those things play out in our own communities. And also in the places where our entertainment is being realized.
And Chris, yeah, I guess every time I read your work and listen to what you say, I'm always kind of convinced that I shouldn't be on the side of the Olympics. Like what you say is exceptionally compelling, and it's impossible not to agree with. It is all those things. I guess in some sense, I always isolate specific social policy issues and see there being a particular gain in certain areas. So if you look at, it depends on the level of analysis. If you look broadly, what these things are doing, they're probably orientating us in the wrong direction in some sense, whilst making some sort of very kind of incremental or in sometimes major social gains. But it's I guess important to see that kind of broader perspective, and that's what the kind of the Realpolitik kind of idea and concept is mainly about, right?
Right, and I think that it can be used with Realpolitik in positive ways too. And as I was an organizer in Brazil against mega events, and the political opportunity of the event allowed for non-related items to come to the fore as well. And you would think, I mean, maybe not non-related, but informal labor. No one was talking about informal labor around Olympics typically. And so, but we had an informal street vendor association. It was like, yeah, hey, this is actually supposed to be good for everybody. So let's get this as a social and political good for us through the event. And we're able to raise that profile. Of course, the event comes in and eliminates all informal labor, and because all those gains have to go to someone else. And so it allows you to see the intersections and the opportunities for promoting, let's say, nominally progressive or inclusive social ideals. But that's always coming up against an event that is by and for the elite. It's elite sport, full stop. It's not popular sport. It's elite sport in elite venues for elite people in elite institutions. And so how do we think that fostering and putting more public money towards elite entertainment is good? Or like we couldn't solve our problems in some other way. So it's not an adequate vehicle for what we're trying to glob onto it as the car speeds by at a million miles an hour. It's like a baby on board sticker on a space shuttle.
Yeah. I so agree with you on pretty much most of that. And the question is, therefore, is there a future whereby major events or mega events, is there a model by which they could ever exist that could instill the kind of values that you're suggesting, the kind of moral and tackle some of those moral ethical dilemmas that are so structural in society? Is there a way in which it could change, albeit theoretically?
Well, we have had alternative games. There are the workers' games in mid-century, communist worker games, which were predicated on solidarity and inclusiveness and men and women competing on same teams. But as long as we have some institution like the IOC, which comes out of the very 19th century, and the IOC, remember, emerges out of this Realpolitik period in the late 19th century, where a French baron wants to have competitions among the civilized nations. And this is why we have fencing and horse dressage and shooting. Like, shooting's dueling. And these are things that the elites, upper class gentlemen of Europe were doing. And so all of these bodily practices are still this colonialist frame, this colonialist Western European frame of organizing the world and what people do with their bodies in the world. And so for me, this whole IOC, FIFA has to collapse under its own weight. It's just being dragged down by its own inability to understand itself as part of the problem. And that I think that emergent games, grassroots games, we can have something that comes up again, where people connect on more equal ground. Something like Ultimate Frisbee. Many people sneer at it, it's Frisbee, but it has a different culture.
Like breakdancing at Paris 2024.
Or other forms of parkour other forms of bodily expression where you can compete, but you're not trying to kill each other. You're just trying to express yourself artistically, and it can be more collaborative and supporting versus having. I mean, and the Olympics are kind of the most gross and obvious model because we have nation states in a race for scarce metallic resources: gold, silver, and bronze. This is no different than the Chinese, the Americans, and the Dutch going after magnesium in the Congo. It's the same thing. And so we have nation states going after scarce mineral resources, both in the physical world and the metaphorical world of the sporting thing. And so these things are the same, and they depend on and grow off each other. And so it's very useful for maintaining the status quo. It's very useful for the propagation of capitalism. It's very useful for the consolidation of elite benefit and privilege. And it comes at the expense of the environment. It comes at the expense of the territories where people live. And essentially it comes at the expense of our own sense of what's right and valuable in the world.
Chris, do you find that when you teach students about these things, do you see it as your responsibility in some sense to try and convince them, or at least kind of get them to kind of think about what their future role is in the events industry when they will eventually graduate from your class?
Yeah, this is a constant conflict I have with my students because, I too, I thought when I was younger that I wanted to go work for FIFA. And this is one of the things that came into my head when I was 23, 24. It's like, yeah, I love football. 94 World Cup was amazing. Why not be part of this thing that I love so much? And I think, and students come in with that and they have dreams, and no one wants to hear that, the thing you thought you were going to do is actually pretty horrible. But you do have to present a way of thinking. So present a way of thinking through it. This is the discursive line here. This is what they're saying about what they're going to do, and this is the outcome we can see 6 years later. Why don't these things ever meet? Who's responsible? Who is in charge of putting in that metro? Where did the contracts go? How do you unpack each one of these Olympic pillars? Has to be unpacked and put into reality somewhere, and not just looked at on a piece of paper, not just looked at on a balance sheet, not just talked about in a classroom, but like, what is the physical outcome here? What are the culture? What actually happened that they said was going to happen? And how do we hold ourselves accountable for that as well? Because we just let them go.
They are, mega events are perfect extreme cases whereby it exacerbates all this sort of stuff, right? They're just perfect. They are microcosms of society at large. So you can almost see every dark side. Wow, that lawnmower is so loud. You can kind of almost see every aspect, dark side of society encapsulated in that protracted period leading up to it, can't you? In some sense, and do you find that students eventually get it? Like, do you find that you've got them to think so critically that they evaluate, rhetoric, reality, the evidence, and to develop a logical argument by the end, or do you find that it's a difficult ask?
It's really difficult because, I mean, as with anyone that's, for instance, in a master's program, and I'm in the School of Professional Studies, we tend to train all our students to solve problems. And I don't think that it's necessarily a problem to be solved. I mean, I think the only solution is to abolish these things, because they'll just take too long to evolve in other ways. But there's no one's going to abolish the Olympics or the World Cup. And so if we look at each one of these elements of, say, a World Cup bid or Olympic bid or hosting the games as a question that has been posed, and then we have to find not a solution to the question, but get people around the table that can talk about that question in an intelligent way, instead of just railing and saying, this is the worst thing. It's like, okay, it's here. Paris is going to have the Olympics. There's nothing we can do about that. What are the questions? All right, next question. Where are they doing it? What is happening in public housing? Okay, let's focus on public housing. What are the conditions? What are the pre-existing conditions? Where are the fractures, the strengths, the opportunities? How can we mitigate risk? And so then we say, well, what do you mean by risk? Who are the Olympics exacerbating or reducing future housing insecurity in Paris? And I think the evidence that it's increasing housing insecurity. And so, okay, well, that's terrible. How can we stop that now? And there may be a solution to that fourth question. How can we stop that? But maybe not. Maybe then, like, who are the activists? Who are the politicians? What are the practical actions we can take? And so each one of them has to, so then I send them down these rabbit holes, and whatever rabbit hole you're interested in, your transportation's your thing, go with transportation. If you're into security, there's a question to be answered there too. Finance, boot suppliers who's making the soccer balls. If you're interested in global labor, let's talk about Nike's sweatshops in Indonesia and Vietnam. Where do you want to go? And there's always a rabbit hole you can find out the real effects. And I think by doing that, you really complexify the reality of it. So there's no easy solution, but there are paths and places where one person can make a difference. And it's finding that place where you are most comfortable, where your talents are most applicable. That is what we try to do in these classes. We say, okay, this is the place where you're probably going to be able to insert yourself the most effectively.
And Chris, on that point, do you think that people are listening in the IOC and FIFA? Do you think there are people that have hearts of gold that see these wicked problems and are trying to come up with solutions, or are people just kind of burying their heads and just kind of slightly ignoring any of this structural change that needs to happen and just allowing it status quo to just go unabated? Because kind of the sense that I get when liaising with major mega event owners and people that are responsible for organizing is that they have this runaway train that they have no sense of how to control it whatsoever, and so therefore, because it's an impossible wicked problem, there seems to be this reticence to actually do anything about it instead of making necessarily incremental change. Is that the vibe that you get as well, or does it differ?
Yeah, well, it's very big. One person rocking the boat is going to get the first one thrown out of the boat as well. And so you have to be very well established and have a lot of political power in order to make these suggestions. And so your own political maneuvering within these circles. Infantino didn't accidentally become president of FIFA. No accident. He'll be there for 5 terms. It's no accident that there have only been 7 presidents of the IOC in 140 years. These are fiefdoms. These are political fiefdoms that have very tight control over the resources and the access to power. And so, yeah, there's not much incentive to change something like FIFA or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. These are very similar. They operate under very similar mechanisms of absolute power, as long as you can hold it. So, yeah, I don't have a lot of hope.
Do you know what? The future looks rubbish, Chris.
Well, in this regard, it's pretty bad. I mean, no one wants to. Why look up? You're making lots of money.
Yeah, it's true.
In terms of, I just don't see the incentive for people on the inside to change it.
Yeah. Like I think that when you think about the future of this concept of realpolitik, it is what. How would you respond to that? Is there a future of this realpolitik, or is it just something that is a cycle that keeps reproducing itself, and there's not really going to be any break? Or how would you respond to that?
Well, we're in such an uncertain geopolitical time at the moment that, there are so many shifts in balance that, even 10 years ago, I don't think anyone would have said NATO was going to be such an important institution. Right ahead of the Sochi Olympics in 2014, there was no talk about NATO, as far as I know. But if you're talking about Sochi Olympics in 2024, we have a whole different scenario. And so, of course, Sochi being another great example of realpolitik, where Putin consolidates international acceptance of his rule. And he's having dinner with Bach and Biden's there in Sochi. Everybody's drinking their champagne. 3 weeks later, they annex Crimea.
Yeah, I know,
So, I mean, there's a perfect example of realpolitik. So, yeah, it's going to be relevant. The Saudis have just, with all of their purchase of the players for football,
Mm.
that's a political statement. The Live Golf, the Qatari World Cups, eventually the Saudi World Cup. We've seen the shifting to East Asia from the Olympic Committee. So we had South Korean and Chinese Winter Olympics and the Japanese Olympics all in a row. So, leaning where the economies are blowing, opening up new markets. And so I think we'll see that this realpolitik in sports in particular will play out on a global level. It just might be, who knows, we might going to be 20 feet underwater in a few weeks. So I don't know. I can't say. But as long as the nation state is the defining political entity of the world, then we're going to have realpolitik.
Well, if anyone wants to find out anything more about this topic, is there any particular resources that you'd suggest that people kind of look at?
Yeah, well, my friend and colleague Jules Boykoff has written quite a lot about the IOC and politics, and he's got a great book called Power Games about the use of the Olympics as a political tool. And he also wrote a recent one about the 1936 Olympics. That was quite good. And then Dave Zirin at The Nation has written a lot about more identity politics, ethnic politics, around sports in the United States. So he's quite a good commentator on to see how these things are playing out. And he writes at The Nation, and he and Jules and Dave write quite a lot together. And then there's a lot on even urban politics. And so if you Google urban politics and the Olympics, you'll see exactly how these things play out. And this is why in New York, people who come to New York are like, well, look at this, that hideous thing on the water, Hudson Yards, was a product of New York's bidding for the Olympics for the 2012 Olympics. And so that's where they wanted to build a stadium. And now we have this hideous skyscraper complex. It's all glass and steel and looks like Spider-Man's birthplace or something, or Superman's birthplace. But that's where they were going to put the stadium, and so they were able to change the zoning, which attracted development interest, and so they kind of prized the lid off that whole part of town, which then mushroomed into a multi-trillion-dollar real estate deal. And so that's, again, realpolitik of the Olympics happening in an urban context. And so there's a lot about this that's out there, and a lot about LA as well, because that's the next one that's going under the radical transformation at the moment.
No, there's definitely a lot. There's definitely a lot of people that we obviously kind of know inside. That there's a lot of kind of research papers out there, and we'll try and add some of the links to these underneath the podcast. That'd be really useful for people to kind of go into a little bit more detail. But yeah, if you look at the academic space, it primarily is a critique of mega events. Academics have played a huge part in this movement, right? And to the point that they've infiltrated communities, residential communities, in order to kind of veto and push back against these things. And people are talking about these large scale events as being as some sort of existential threat back to kind of 40 years ago in the early 80s after Montreal. So
right.
I think that the tide is absolutely turning, and you do have some great people on the ground like Mary Harvey and William Rourke at the Center for Sport and Human Rights that are trying to work with FIFA to install some sort of kind of human rights volunteer program I've seen recently, and to try and do some sort of incremental changes that you mentioned, Chris, because you're not going to change the entire system, but maybe 1% at a time, and creating a habit of kind of critiquing. That might be the way in which we're going to, not take down the beast, because I have less of a default, less of a critical default stance on them, because I look at it from a different level, I think, like on a specific level. But every time I talk to you and I listen to your work, I think, why do I say anything positive about these things? I feel like I feel like I'm a traitor to my own academic class, and I should be doing something about it. But But again, there's whole levels to this. There's the one level that we haven't talked about is the positive effect that events and festivals and major events have on the individual, how they improve psychic income, how they make people more motivated for employment and work. There's an argument there. So there is a ton of positive things that I
Yeah.
would say, which we primarily, I would argue that this podcast, I would argue it says is probably about 80% more appreciative or positive about events and their leveraging capability than they are critical. So it's great that we have this Realpolitik stance to kind of really contrast, because it is so important. And even as an academic and working with these people, you do have to slightly appease them in some sense. You do have to bowdlerize what you're saying and pick apart your critical argument to be more acceptable
Yeah.
to people on the ground. And you find yourself kind of slightly conceding certain ground in order to have a dialogue and I never know where the line is. And it's a difficult one, I think, for academics, right, Chris?
Yeah, and that line is shifting all the time, and it's also, it's a question of language, and I think that this is where academics have been particularly helpful in helping frame, and the discourse has changed. And so it used to be just growth, 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 benefit, 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 legacy, legacy, legacy. And we started questioning the word legacy many years ago. And now legacy is a contested term. What do you mean by legacy for whom? Under what conditions? Is it legacy can be bad? There are terrible legacies from all kinds of things. And so, because they at one point realized that impact was not a good word for them, because there were negative impacts, and so that flipped to legacy, and they were like, well, yeah, we're doing the same stuff with a different word, so let's look at what you're meaning and parse that apart. And so I think there's a real, academics have been, and not just me, but many others have been on the ground talking with people and saying, and translating this academic critique into language that helps when you. So one of the things that FIFA or IOC will come with a very academic discourse too, academic business. And if you don't have the language to understand what they mean when they say that, then you need to study up real quick, because you agree to it. It's like a contract. It's like the mythical selling of Manhattan to the Lenape Indians. Like, here's a piece of paper. Like, yeah, whatever. Okay, well, thanks. We just bought it. Like, what? That's kind of how mega events work, with a contract.
That is true. It's completely true.
Yeah.
We just wrote a paper. It just came out last week. It kind of drawing on the idea of stakeholder salience, because essentially, I think everyone can see, like, it doesn't matter who you are, even if you're owning a mega event or major event or a large scale event or a medium sized event, it just doesn't matter. I was always fascinated with just a basic research question, which is, why is it that local interests seem so central and fated at the very beginning, only to then become deprioritized toward the live staging and afterwards? That is a broad question. It's an obvious question, and they must be losing something. They must be losing some sort of legitimacy, some power, whatever, certain attributes. So we looked at it, and essentially, like, one of the main arguments is that they just become written out. Like, they are really specifically identified at the very beginning, and then in the discourse, they just get written out. They become nameless or placeless, and that's the way in which you're not held by the same standard at the very beginning, by just making it all a bit general, and it's departicularized, or someone said something like that, and so it's interesting how the mechanisms that are used, and I don't think necessarily there is a like some kind of people that are exceptionally critical of neoliberalism, that there is some sort of puppet master, some sort of Illuminati-like organization that fuels some sort of conspiracy. There's actually a lot of very well-meaning people that are just completely ignorant of reality, and that they mean well, but actually they don't understand the unintended consequences of all of it.
Well, and you can't understand when you're under pressure and you have a very narrow task, and your task is to deliver 20,000 bagels to that stadium at 8 o'clock on these days. You don't have time to think about anything else, because it's very reductive all this stuff happens through reductive processes. And so we've got to train people to do very narrow jobs to make these events work. You don't want the electrician pondering metaphysics while he's plugging in 50,000 volts. You want him to concentrate and get the damn thing in the socket. And so that's how we train people, and that's our fault. It's not our fault, but it's just the way of the world, that we are. And then if you're not looking, someone else is writing you out of the story.
Mm-hmm. It's true. It's true. I thought that it was well parodied by the London 2012, the 2012 BBC mockumentary. The difference between sustainability and legacy, because it happens on the other end, which is that you're so general, you have no understanding how to operationalize it, unlike the engineer on the ground. So it's quite interesting that it's the unique properties of the way in which the Olympics is governed, and the problem of many hands and all that sort of stuff that allows the kind of the buck to shift in ways that I don't think anyone means necessarily, although they might mean it in a micro sense, but not the big macro sense. There's no big marionette. Would you argue against that? Would you rebut that, Chris?
I would not argue against that. I would say that Realpolitik also involves intentional or designed lacuna. So I designed holes and absences of responsibility where things can just happen. And so I would like to think, and as you've been around a million events, we know these things happen. A lot of it's very spontaneous. Like someone comes together, like you slap the sign up with a piece of gum, and okay, now you've got a sign. But when we think about the legal aspects, which is the design of the event is a legal document, and those legal documents design responsibilities for parties, and it's very few places where everyone has responsibility for taking care of one thing. And so FIFA has a responsibility for stadiums, the federal government for financing and policing, the state government for the highways, and the city government for traffic control. Who's responsible for the event? Nobody, because there are all these things, and then it's just so multi-layered. And so it's just by design, the president of FIFA is not putting his signature on a sustainability document, nor is the mayor. They're not held responsible for that document. They're only held responsible for the financing or the delivery of a certain thing. They can't be held responsible for a promise. So there's this designed absence that allows for the perception of marionette, but the event itself is a living thing. And I think we tend to forget about that. The event, let's say Los Angeles 2024, is in itself a living being in kind of this non-representational theory way. It's an actor. You say LA 2024, and you're referring to a thing in the world. And so that's not IOC, it's not LA, it's not USOC, it's not the people that live there, it's just this thing. And I think that we have to understand that that's the marionette that we're talking about, is this thing that we've created that has, we don't know, AI is in control of it for all I know.
So like the marionette kind of likeness is it's not that, it's more of a kind of a gap, a sinking hole that things can just simply drop through and get lost through in space and time. Yeah. I like that. That's a nice way of thinking about it, because you can't, because people have tried to identify marionette, puppet masters, but seeing it the other way, identifying the gaps and where absences happen and allow things to slip through is an interesting way of thinking about it. Chris, my laptop I think is overheating, so my camera doesn't look like it's working so well. But thank you so much for coming on Inside Events to talk about Realpolitik. We'll definitely pop some of the resources underneath. We'll have a chat afterwards and try kind of maybe provide some resources if people are interested in knowing more. But thanks for coming on and providing that real contrast perspective to rebut a lot of the things that the rhetoric says that major events are. And it's really important to have that constructive dialogue. So thanks for coming along.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a great conversation, as ever.